everybody, and welcome to another Agile IT Tech Talk. I'm your host, Sean Spicer, and today we're going to be talking about CMMC in Compliance Manager. So if you're not in the DoD space, you may not have heard of CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And it's a new certification which is replacing the self-attestation process that had been in place for the last 3 or 4 years around DFARS and NIST 800-171. And what the DoD was finding was that people were attesting to security that they didn't have. And about 2 weeks ago, the DFARS supplementary language was changed or published that brought CMMC into play. And it's going to go into effect after a public comment period. And that will be going into effect on November 30th. Now, for those of you not in the DoD space, this may seem like something that's not going to affect you. And everybody thought this was just going to be DoD, but back in September, the federal government surprised everybody by adding CMMC language to the STARS 3 contract, which was a $10 billion purchasing vehicle that was applied to anyone applying for federal contracts with an 8A designation, which is your disadvantaged businesses, minority-owned, disabled veterans, veteran-owned, women-owned. And so anybody providing IT services to the federal government under the STARS 3 contract vehicle is going to be required to meet CMMC. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way CMMC is laid out before we get into the cool stuff in Compliance Manager. The reason I wanted to do this today is that during Microsoft Ignite 2 weeks ago, they changed a lot about Compliance Manager. So you used to get about 10 different compliance templates that you could work with, and they came free in E3 licensing. And now the only thing you're going to get without E5 licensing is the Microsoft Data Protection Baseline. If you want additional ones like GDPR, NIST 800-171, you'll have to have an E5 license. And then there are new premium templates that are currently available in E5, but are going to go and eventually become a separate purchase. There's new connectors. They really did a lot of cool stuff in Compliance Manager to make this more of a robust platform of its own, instead of just kind of a slapped on add-on that managed compliance in Office 365. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about why compliance is important and why it exists. And there's a number of reasons why a company might need compliance. But let's start by asking why there are compliance frameworks to begin with. Compliance frameworks are not security, but they almost always are created to protect something. HIPAA protects healthcare records. PCI protects credit card and banking information. And the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, tries to protect us from getting norovirus from lettuce. And why? Because of malfeasance and risk. When industries are unregulated, they mess things up, sometimes accidentally and sometimes on purpose with a profit motive. Compliance frameworks put restrictions on company behavior with the threat of repercussions, be it legislative or financial. So in the DoD space, when companies operate without oversight, the stakes are much higher, and being careless with that information can lead to great harm to national security. In introducing CMMC, Katie Arrington, who was then the CISO for the Undersecretary of Defense, stated that 1% of global GDP is lost to cybercrime. And that effect on economic security becomes a flow-down effect on national security. Now, the biggest threat to the defense industrial base, which are DoD contractors, are APTs, Advanced Persistent Threats. These are generally nation states or organizations sponsored by them, but in some cases, they're also economically driven. Next of great concern to us are supply chain attacks, where attackers are able to infiltrate more sensitive systems by coming in via less secure suppliers. So for an example that I give frequently to people giving us a call is you've got Betty Bolts, who is in procurement or accounts payable at a company that makes bolts that just mount hardware inside aircraft or military vehicles. There's nothing special about the bolts. They're commercial off the shelf, but they're selling those bolts to somebody like Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics. And because they don't have security at this bolt company, She goes, clicks on a phishing email. She gets her account breached. The advanced persistent threat hangs out there for a while, watches what's going on in her email, who she's interacting with, and one day sends off a PDF that has some form of ransomware or malware in it, and they are able to get higher in the supply chain in terms of what they have access to. So it's really important in that space to think about what the upstream effects are if you don't have good security. And this applies to banks. I mean, even if you're a marketing company and you just have a great big email list or some sort of demographic information, think about what happens to those people whose data you manage and whose money you manage when you suffer a breach. And that is why compliance gets put in there. And finally, another reason for compliance is good old industrial espionage, where private companies attempt to steal trade secrets from each other for use in their own products and endeavors. There was just an incredible case, I believe it was 7 years in prison, given to a Google engineer who had been working on self-driving cars and then went to Uber and took a thumb drive with him. And this kind of stuff can be protected against with data loss prevention and setting up the right security protocols within your business. And compliance manager, if you are in a business where compliance and your security teams are separated, it's great because it gives your compliance team access to security signals so they don't need to know if a computer's got a virus or doesn't have a patch. But if Betty Bolt goes and suddenly downloads 50 gigs of files from a place that she doesn't normally work, you're going to want to know that. And so a lot of these things are built into Azure Information Protection, Cloud App Security, but Compliance Manager gives your compliance team a single pane of glass. So the question is, why be compliance? And for the DoD, it comes down to federal contracts. If you're not compliant, you don't get contracts, no more business. Corporate security, cyber attacks are costly. We've heard the numbers before, but IBM and the Ponemon Institute found that 66% of businesses are unable to recover after a cyber attack. And when working with CMMC in the defense industrial base, national security. And each of these matter, but depending on the mindset of the business, the individual drivers may lean towards one or the other. So I'm going to just run through this really quick because if you work in the DoD space, you understand controlled and classified information, and you also understand high side and low side environments that you can't have actual classified information anywhere except in a high side environment. So in Office 365, what we really focus on is managing controlled and classified information. We have a special environment that we work with called GCC High. And if you manage CUI or FCI, odds are you're going to need to move to that environment. And I've done some previous tech talks and videos around this. I try to keep it out of our normal Thursday tech talk cycle because it is so very specific to the DoD. And CUI is actually relatively new. It was created in 2008 and I believe passed into law in 2010. And it was an attempt to consolidate over 100 different information designations for unclassified information into a more coherent structure. So all of these different agencies were coming up with different markings. And once you start to work in interagency collaboration, well, what does FOUO mean? What does SBU mean? And it's, well, for official use only and sensitive but unclassified. So by consolidating that into a common framework, things were meant to become much more simpler during the federal acquisitions process. So CMMC, as I mentioned before, stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And unlike all of the other DoD-related compliance frameworks, this is an actual certification. So previously, contractors just attested that they met certain requirements, and then they would maintain documentation like system security plans and plans of actions and milestones, POAMs, that said where they were on their security journey. They didn't have to actually meet everything in NIST 800-171. They just had to show that they were making efforts, say that they were going to become complete at a certain time in the future, and then update those POAMs to show that they were meeting constant deadlines or constant improvement. And This falls into a really old act called the Lincoln Act, and I don't want to get too deep into this. I've made another presentation around it. But if you have attested to the DoD, to the federal government, that you are doing something in order to get a contract, you fall under what's known as the Lincoln Law, the False Claims Act. And this was created back in the Civil War to keep people from selling sick horses and faulty uniforms and gunpowder that was actually wood powder. And the False Claims Act awards people who bring claims against their own company 50% of the damages that the federal government is able to reclaim for contract fraud. And in 2019, I know of 2 cases where federal contractors were brought up on False Claims Act charges because of a lack of cybersecurity, that they said they were meeting NIST, they said they had a plan, and somebody went to the government and said, hey, we're really not secure. So CMMC is a maturity model, and it's built on 17 capability domains that pretty much encompass every facet of modern infrastructure. These domains are then broken down into practices and processes in the maturity model. And because this is a maturity model, it's additive. So to meet level 3, you must also meet all of the controls in level 2 and in level 1, and so on and so on. So I want to take a quick look at the processes first. At level 1, we have the most basic of controls. Do computers automatically lock after activity? Do they have passwords, antivirus, backups, the stuff that you really consider basic, and a lot of people do for their own homes? With level 2, a few controls are added, but at this stage, it's more about the documentation of process in reaching those controls. At level 3, which is the most common level we encounter, we see the mention of relevant stakeholders. And this is incredibly important. If nobody owns something, no one's going to do it. And I jokingly call this the blame stage. And at this point, every practice must have a directly responsible individual. The goal here is to make security part of the culture of an organization. And the idea is that if security is central to operations and central to the way a company does business, then it will be maintained when the organization is placed under stress, be it from a cyber attack, an economic event, COVID-19, or some other critical event, because it will be in the DNA of the company. Now, with practices, you start to see the overlap between CMMC and other compliance frameworks, such as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, NIST 800-171. And when creating CMMC, they pulled in cybersecurity regulations from around the world in order to create a really good framework to secure your environments. What's really fun is with levels 4 and 5, we see security become a more integral part of the entire organization, but we also start to see advanced capabilities as security organizations become proactive and become threat hunters rather than just threat defenders. So this is the CMMC practice documentation in Excel format. And I really like CMMC. I had to spend a lot of time reading ITAR, reading NIST 800-171, ISO 27001 to really understand the requirements of cybersecurity that we provide. And this is one way to look at it. In a tabular document, inside the Excel spreadsheet, there are tabs for every control. But they also have an Appendices document that I love, because if you weren't born with a Kali Linux thumb drive in your hand, sometimes, particularly NIST 800-171, can be really difficult to interpret broadly and apply those to your specific environment, your specific needs, and to reach compliance. CMMC wants to be very clear, and compliance is not a checklist. Just keep that in mind. Security is not a checklist. There may be a checklist that you have to complete, but really it is an ongoing process. That's why the maturity model is so important. And what I really like here is that every section has an example. And if you're not that Kali Linux baby that I was talking about a minute ago, this is really helpful because it helps you understand in a real world example how this is applied. Now, Compliance Manager, as you'll see, has quite a bit of documentation. and a lot of good examples and practices, and will actually help you implement specific controls. But actually reading the CMMC appendices is a great way to wrap your head around this. And like I mentioned, the federal government beat the DoD to the punch in getting this out, and I expect over the coming years, as the maturity model becomes more mature and really has that real world experience built into it and it advances, I expect to see this replace ISO 27001, replace NIST 800-171, and probably replace NIST CFS, the cybersecurity framework, as the de facto standard. And as more and more third-party auditing organizations become available, I see this becoming the next wave of cybersecurity credentialing and verification. So let's real quick jump over into our environment and let me get that demo going. Pardon me just a second. So I do want to show you real quick. You can get the CMMC documentation at hcq.osd.mil. And the model PDF is okay. You do want to take a look at that. But if you really want to familiarize yourself with it, you want to get the appendices. And this is the Excel spreadsheet that I showed a minute ago. So the documentation is there for anybody to take a look at. It is kept up to date. I saw this come in at the original draft version, and they're updating. I think the last update was in September or October. This is the appendices document. I'll shoot down, just take one quick look at a control, and you can see it a level 4. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way these are structured. So this is auditing, level 4, control 53. It talks about why, clarifies what the importance is, gives the reference documentation that they called upon in order to create it, has the discussion that talks about where and why they decided to bring in these frameworks, and then the clarification and examples. But let's see how this looks in the new Compliance Manager. So in order to get to Compliance Manager, you just go click Admin in your Office environment. You're going to go ahead and show all. We're going to go to Compliance. Now, it's important to note that Microsoft 365 Compliance up here is not the Compliance Manager. This is the Compliance Center. And in the Compliance Center, you have, this is where you manage compliance for your entire organization. And one of the cool things that was expanded at Microsoft Ignite are the data sources and connectors. So what's great about this is if you have a compliant environment where you need to be concerned about things like insider trading, insider risk, HIPAA, you can actually manage what's being posted by your dumb marketing manager like me on Facebook, on LinkedIn, but you can also expand this into other platforms. So you've got Slack. I believe we've got Zoom in here now. Yep, Zoom. And you can stack compliance onto solutions that aren't Microsoft oriented yet. And we've got alerts. We're going to be able to see where somebody's sending out PCI. And of course, as always, it's Megan Bowen. But this is not a place for security. This is a place for security-related incidents that a compliance officer or compliance manager would be concerned about monitoring. So let's go into the compliance manager and look how this gets set up. Now, this is a brand new tenant that I turned on today. And you'll see we're already at 69% compliance. And the reason for this is these Microsoft managed points. And this is one of the great things about the cloud is when you move to the cloud, be it Office 365 or Azure, GCC High, Azure Government, what occurs is you suddenly enter a shared responsibility model because Microsoft or AWS owns that data center. Most of your physical requirements that you have to attest to or have certified with CMMC have been met already, and they're documented, and there is already a certification that you can lean on when you're going through your own audit. So let's go ahead, and right now this is just based off the Microsoft data protection baseline, and we can see it there. It's incomplete because there are 499 actions, of which we only have 4 done. Actually, I don't want to go here yet. What we're going to do is we're going to create an assessment group for CMMC and for DoD contractors. And if you're in HIPAA, if you are in finance, these are going to apply to you as well. So I mentioned that there are a lot of new assessment templates. So these are included in your E5 licensing. The data protection baseline is included, I believe, in all licensing, but specifically in 3. But then these premium templates, and it warns up here that premium templates will be subject to new licensing terms in the near future. Microsoft has not revealed the details of that yet, but since they're currently built in, I want to show this off. And as you can see, we've got global requirements. CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is already being built into the draft of the US version of the GDPR. We've got CMMC Level 1 through 5. Now, earlier I talked about how CMMC is a maturity model. So to meet Level 3, you have to have Level 1. In Compliance Manager, it already takes this into account. You do not need to have Level 1, 2, and 3. However, if you are moving into CMMC and you're not sure what you need to meet, if you do CMMC Level 1 and you complete an action, then when you bring in CMMC Level 2 into the same compliance group, it will already show those actions as complete and have all of the same documentation you've already compiled around it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to add CMMC Level 3. And it's going to come up and talk to us about what the controls and actions are. Now, one thing that's important to note is that there are controls and there are actions. Microsoft breaks down controls into individual actions. And I'm going to show off 1 or 2 places where this happens, where one control may have 7 different actions, but one action may impact 4 or 5 controls. So MFA is a really good example of this. So in order to add this to our environment, we're going to go ahead and create an assessment. Now we're going to give the assessment a name. For this one, we're going to call it CMMC Level 3. Now, compliance is not a one and done event. So I strongly encourage anyone doing this to give it a date by year and month. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a new group. And we're going to call this DoD Compliance. And we're going to do, that's funny and apropos. We're going to go ahead and give it the same year and month. Now, in the future, if I'm going to do a DoD compliance cycle in terms of another audit or maybe just a review and implementation, I can copy data from an older group. So I'll create DoD compliance 2022, and then I can copy data, including the implementation, test plan, and documents that are already there, so that I don't have to rework everything. So we're going to go ahead and click next. This thing. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to create the assessment. Takes just a couple seconds. We're going to go ahead and click done, but that's not the only compliance thing that we have to meet. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to go back to assessments. And if you are a DoD contractor, you also have to deal with HIPAA and DFARS. I can't spell DFARS. There we go. And DFARS is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're going to go ahead and create an assessment. We're going to call this DFARS 10 or 2020-10. And then this time we're going to use an existing group. Now, the groups are really important because the groups are cross-referenced. If you have 2 groups and they each have assessments in them, if you complete the action in one assessment, it will not affect an assessment in another group unless it is an automatically tested control. So Compliance Manager knows if you have MFA enabled for all of your global admins. And if that setting is correct, it'll automatically show up as tested and provide the documentation on how and when. So we're going to go ahead and create this assessment. Now, one of the interesting things about the DFARS language that came out around CMMC is that CMMC is going to be rolled out over 5 years. And right now, the really big contractors have been working with the CMMC authority in order to help create this process. And some of their subcontractors are already getting requests to start meeting CMMC compliance. However, what the new DFARS language says is that all DoD contractors must complete a NIST 800-171 self-assessment and upload that to a DoD database if they want to win any contracts. And until they are requested to reach a certain CMMC level, that will be where the DoD is tracking compliance. So there is an immediate action. So the reason I bring that up is we're going to go ahead and we're going to add NIST 800-171 by going back to assessments, assessment templates, and that's 853. They did not take NIST out, did they? And there it is. I don't know why that wasn't coming up. So we're going to add NIST 800-171, and NIST 800-171 lives in the middle of CMMC Level 3. If you are compliant with NIST or with CMMC Level 3, you will have met all of the controls in NIST 800-171. So we're going to go ahead, call this NIST 800-171 2020-10. Use that DoD group we created and save it. And so now you can understand how assessment frameworks and assessment templates live together inside of a group. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look inside that group and we're going to look at controls and see how we manage them. And then after that, we're going to go through and we're going to meet a control in a nice make-believe environment. So when we come back to Compliance Manager, we're going to have our overview. You can see we have a lot more points now. But we also gained a lot more through that shared responsibility model. And this is a lot like security score. So you can see we have 905 actions to work through. This is quite a workload, but thankfully, Compliance Manager is going to help us do it. So the next thing we want to do is go to Assessments. And you can see we have these applied. We can go into the individual ones, but rather than that, I want to go to improvement actions. And instead of focusing on the individual control, I want to focus on the actions that have the most impact in the organization. And that's where the points come in. These points are Microsoft created, and it comes into the same model as security score, is go for the actions that have the most bang for the buck. And so self-service password reset, MFA, conditional access, these are really the first steps you take. Now, up here, I'm going to give a quick anatomy of what we're seeing here. This is called at a glance, but really this is your at a glance. So you can see how far you've gotten on achieving it. You can see when it was implemented, what status is there, whether it's been tested, who it's assigned to. And over here at a glance, this shows you what frameworks it applies to. Now you'll see that it's got CMMC Level 3 listed twice. This may seem a little bit confusing, but when we look, we can see, and this comes into that control ID I talked about earlier. So this is for control identity or identification and authentication, Level 2, Control 78. And then we can search for that within the CMMC documentation if we want more information about it. Gives a quick description, but then it also applies to Control 79 for password reuse. So you can prohibit password reuse when setting this up. NIST 800-171, and least privilege access. So by completing this action, it's going to impact all of these controls. And I'm going to ignore the data protection baseline, but to show it, this is Microsoft's internal. This is best practices if you are not in a regulated environment. So the great thing is here is with implementation, it gives you directions on how to do it. And by clicking Launch Now, it takes you right to the admin interface that you need to be in order to implement it. And in a lot of these cases, it's going to automatically test. And I'll show you what an automatic test looks like in a minute. Now over here in Notes and Documentations, see up here it says this action is automatically monitored. Learn more, this will give you more documentation on how it's monitored. So we can go ahead and we can manage documents. So, pardon me, we can upload PDFs, actually any sort of file, Visio documents, JPEGs, memes, GIFs, whatever you want can go in here. But let's go back to one that is not self-control or automatically managed. And let's see. All right, apply sensitivity labels. So here we have the status, but we also have the button to edit status. So what we can do is we can manage documents, add one, and that can just be anything. We'll add, oops, got that. Oh, shoot, I don't even have pictures in here. As I mentioned before, I use my son's computer for this stuff. There we go. Let's go ahead and upload that CMMC spreadsheet. So this also becomes collaborative. So there are different levels of access in a compliance manager, just like you've got with security reader. You can have people that can come in and read the documentation. This is really helpful for an auditor. And before we're done here, I'm also going to show, pardon me, I'm going to show how to export reports. So implementation notes is where we would, let's say, first glance at action 10/15/2020 by Sean Spicer. And I'm going to go ahead and leave my typo in there, keep some authenticity. And now I've looked. But again, there's hundreds of things we have to do. One person can't do this. So this is where the cool part about Compliance Manager comes in, is we can assign these actions. And so we're going to go ahead and assign this to Alan DeYoung. And we're going to select the implementation status planned. We don't want to do not implemented because that's an end state. So planned means we're planning on doing it by assigning, that's the first step to the plan. And we can't do the implementation date or test status yet because it hasn't been implemented. So we're going to save and close. And rather than signing into Alan's account, I'm just going to say, Alan right now will receive a notification in email telling him that he has been assigned to apply sensitivity labels to protect EPHI, and he will have a link that comes directly to this page. So let's pretend for a second that we are Alan, and we're going to come in here and we're going to edit status, and we're going to say that we implemented it. Now we can set a date. And let's say that Alan was like, I did that yesterday. What are you talking about? And then we save and close. And the reason why we save and close, even though it's not assessed, is because then what we want to do is we want to come over here and we will implemented by Alan DeYoung, and we will say 10/14. And here you can also add any additional notes. So if there was a workaround, had to log in with phone, use alternative ID. Save and close. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to reassign it. So now we get rid of Alan, still pretending we're Alan, and we're going to say, hey, Alex, test. And now Alex is going to get an email stating that he has been assigned this. And again, we'll have a link here. he still has links to the documentation as well as the, the link directly to the relevant admin center where he would implement it. And he's going to go ahead and run a test. And tested sensitivity labels with regular expressions to ID DoD contract numbers. Now, again, I have done tech talks in the past about intelligent labeling and how you can use regex to identify sensitive information, PII, within your Office 365 organization. That can be insurance information, bank account numbers, and there are hundreds of available templates for you to identify that information. So now we're going to go to edit status, and we're going to say test status passed, select a date, today, and save and close. And we've got a green light here for test status passed. And so now we go back to improvement actions, and we just go down the line. Now, there are ways to manage this in intelligent ways. There are abilities to filter. And in this case, I want to go ahead and get rid of the data protection baseline and DFARS and apply. And then let's go ahead and change the test status so that we're only looking, whoops. Is that buried down here? Yep. So we're only looking at past actions. So we can see what our completion is, and we can also see what that control we just fixed was. So here you can see we've got 27 points achieved. We can see it's still showing the data protection baseline. I messed up my filter, didn't I? There we go. So now we can see what regulations it meets, what group it's in, and then what the solutions are. And there are in-scope and out-of-scope solutions with Microsoft 365. All of the tools are in scope. Now, the one thing I do want to point out is that when you come into CMMC, there are control areas that are not mentioned, and they are around training and awareness. They are around situational awareness, things that do not involve your Office 365 environment. However, you can still manage them in Compliance Manager. And this is a super cool feature. I doubt that anybody has to meet specific controls that don't fall in to the existing assessment templates. But up here, you can create a new template. And we're going to go ahead and so you can add controls, improvement actions, and dimensions to all of these assessment templates. I don't recommend doing it because if Microsoft changes things, there's a chance that you're going to lose it. There's a chance that in the future, the changes aren't going to be there. So I recommend creating an add-on expansion control. So what we're going to do is we're going to download the sample Excel file. And I'm just going to show this really quick. This takes a while and it can be a little bit confusing. So what you've got is you've got your control family. You're going to pull that from CMMC, and you want those control name to be, so for training and awareness, it's TA, then control family would be the level, control title would be the long title of something there, so provide cybersecurity training on an annual basis, and then control description, those are the things that you see within your actions as you are trying to reach compliance with Compliance Manager. You can add multiple actions, and remember that you're not creating a template for an action, you're creating a template for every action around this new add-on. And so this is handy if you do want to use Compliance Manager to track non-cybersecurity related controls. For example, there are regulations in California around cannabis businesses that your doorknobs have to be bulletproof. I just love going back to that one. And you can just upload a copy of a receipt, say, yeah, we bought a bulletproof doorknob. There it is. So that can be done. And then, no, we can remove all that stuff. And then what we'll do, click next, just upload the template file, and then that will show up within the assessment templates with the name that you've given it within that Excel spreadsheet. I will probably do a walkthrough video and blog around this, but it takes a really long time. I'm about halfway through with what I'm calling the CMMC Gap template, which adds all of these, and we will be providing that to our DoD clients in the future. So next, let's go back to home and pretend that we're a chief compliance officer who is monitoring this process. And now we can see across our controls where we are in terms of meeting them. We can come back into Compliance Manager and we can look at individual assessments and see where we are in terms of meeting them. And this really just becomes a solid place to manage the process towards compliance. And I have been astounded by the amount of people that are calling up, actually both pleasantly surprised and grotesquely horrified when I'm talking to somebody who's been working as a DoD contractor for 10 years and was introduced to DFARS language in 2017 around NIST 800-171, and they've never read their contract. And they just got a phone call from their prime contractor saying, hey, let's talk next Wednesday about NIST 800-171. And their immediate response is, what's that? So definitely not a place you want to be in. But I also have great calls with DoD contractors that are, hey, listen, we're 85% complete with NIST 800-171. We've got some issues with our hybrid environment, making sure that we're meeting all of these separate compliance requirements for multiple environments, and we really want to move to the cloud. And it is awesome to hear how people have managed this. There are third-party applications out there that do this, just like there are, you can get WebRoot for antivirus, or you can use Microsoft Defender. And of course, you guys know that I'm this Microsoft evangelist. But when you bring more things under a single vendor, particularly one with the process maturity of Microsoft, what you do is you start to eliminate gaps. And that's where things like Compliance Manager and Secure Score come into play, is because they're all built into the same substrate. You don't have to go to 1,000 different places, and you get the single pane of glass that we just saw in Compliance Manager. And we get the single view of what our security posture is and what our threat landscape is. The last thing I want to do, I jumped over to my closed screen a little bit early, is I want to show you how you go ahead and generate a report for your nice friendly auditor that's coming. Now, odds are you're going to want to give them guest access into this environment, or have your hand on their shoulder as they question your documentation. This report comes out and shows you every single control action, or every single control and the action taken, who owns it, what the score is, when it was implemented, when it was tested, who took care of it, and who is the owner. That goes back to that level 3 where I talked about the blame game. So now you can see who your directly assigned individual is, and your auditor can come in and use this to look specifically at each of these controls and really should ease the process. And again, we have this for all of the Microsoft managed controls. And in here, you have how Microsoft tested everything. You have how Microsoft implemented. And these are also good to look at as you're going through your own process with your own actions that you need to meet, because you're going to see how thorough Microsoft is with these. And in the case where there are third-party documentations, such as Microsoft's provisional authority to operate from the DoD, or their FedRAMP moderate for the commercial environment from the Department of Health, all of that documentation is available in the Trust and Compliance Center. There is a caveat. If you are in GCC High and you need information on FedRAMP High Impact, ITAR, those are not freely available within the Trust and Compliance Center. because you have to sign an NDA to see them, because these are federal documents that Microsoft worked to complete with the federal government. They will protect you. They do have flowdowns in GCC High. The documentation is just not freely available, and anybody who's working in GCC High understands it's kind of a black box for that security through obscurity approach to things. So I hope this is useful. I know that if you aren't in the DoD space, that you probably have HIPAA, PCI, FINRA, your own compliance requirements that you have to meet. Compliance Manager is a great tool for it. We work within the DoD space. We work with banks and credit unions. We work with hospitals and healthcare organizations in order to implement environments that are secure and compliant. So if you are looking at pursuing this wonderful path, or you are stuck somewhere along the way, feel free to reach out. If you're watching online and on YouTube or at our blog, go ahead and leave questions and comments in the comments section below. Give us a like and follow. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great week.